You know, some people make the mistake and they think, since I can't fix everything, I won't do anything. But everybody can do something.
God has given it to us to share with others, and shame on us if we are hoarding it for ourselves.
You have to see it firsthand. You've got to taste it. You've got to smell it. You've got to feel it. Jesus trafficked amongst the lepers of his day.
That first day years ago, when I had my first exposure to extreme poverty in Rakai, Uganda, the question on my lips was, where's the church? Where was the church in the midst of the AIDS pandemic? And it broke my heart to realize that the church, at least the church in America, had not responded to the needs of widows and orphans in their distress that I was seeing really for the first time in my life that day in Uganda. And many of you might be doing this study in your church or through your church. And I want to speak a little bit to the church. And maybe I'm speaking to your church, but I'm speaking to churches in general. And you need to know that I have a great heart for the church. I love the church. I've been involved with the church my entire adult life. I believe, as my friend Bill Hybels says, that the church is the great hope of the world. The church really is the hope of the world. It's God's plan for the world, is to use the church to redeem the world and to be God's ambassadors in the world. But in my book, I had to have some straight talk with churches and about churches, because in my estimation, there are so many churches in America that are not carrying their weight. They're not doing that which God has called them to do in the way that God has called them to do it. They're, you could say, abdicating their responsibility, especially their responsibility for poverty and justice in our world. Now, don't get me wrong, I know some amazing churches, yours may be one of them, that are literally living out the second greatest commandment, to love our neighbors as ourselves in incredible ways through their ministries, their missions programs, their giving, in every way imaginable. If we look at the faith community in the United States, church goers as well as churches, the conclusion I came to is that we're not doing what God called us to do in the way God called us to do it.
Now, like many of you, I grew up in a church where I heard a lot about personal sin and personal salvation and about accepting Jesus and saving souls. But I heard virtually nothing about injustice or poverty or racism.
There's a chapter in my book I call 2% of 2%. And what I meant by that is, if you look at how much do Christians in America give to their churches or give to ministries, Christian ministries, including their churches, it's about 2.5% of their income. Now, we know the biblical tithe is 10%, so we're 75% short of what God called us to do as a minimum, 2.5%. Well, then our churches take that money. What percent of that money goes from our churches to the rest of the world internationally, goes outside of our community or outside of our country? That's also 2%. So you could say that our gift to the world, our compassion toward the world, is 2% of 2%. It works out to be about 6 cents per day per churchgoer in the United States. That's what we're doing financially about poverty and health problems and injustice and the things we see around our world. I did a calculation that said, well, how much money would it be if everybody tithed their income at 10% instead of 2.5%? What if we tithed? How much extra money would the Church of Jesus Christ have to invest in kingdom work around the world? And the answer was, for a recent year, $168 billion. That's how much extra we would have if everyone tithed. Now, how much money is that? That's a big number. The total foreign assistance of all the nations in the world to the poor nations of the world last year was about $104 billion. So Christians in America, if they just gave that extra 7.5%, would dwarf the total foreign assistance budget of all the governments of the world combined. We could eradicate extreme poverty as we know it. We could bring clean water to the more than 1 billion people that don't have it. We could make sure that every child finishes primary school and many children finish secondary school. We could provide microloans to lift millions of people out of poverty. We could do the health interventions for malaria and HIV and AIDS and tuberculosis and waterborne diseases that are so desperately needed. We could literally change the world if only American Christians would tithe their income. So my challenge to the church, my challenge to the faith community is to be the church, to be the gospel to a hurting world.
When you think of what's normal for a church, or what's been normal in many churches past 50 or 100 years, you go to a church and it's normal to be preached to. It's normal to have music, praise band or choir or something. It's normal for there to be children's ministry and so. We dream of the day when it would be normal for every church to be engaged in the AIDS battle.
One of the revelations I've had over the last few years is a revelation about the second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus tells us that that's the second greatest commandment of all. Love your neighbor as yourself. And like most people, I've always thought that my neighbor, who is my neighbor? That's the basis of the parable of the Good Samaritan. My neighbor is the person in need that is near me, someone that I see, I can touch, maybe someone I know, someone at work, someone at church, someone in my neighborhood. That's my neighbor. And that those are the people I'm to love as much as I love myself. That's all changed. And it's all changed for the first time in recorded history since the Bible was written, because until about 50 or 60 years ago, the right answer to that question was absolutely that. Your neighbor is the person in your immediate vicinity that you're aware of and you know about. But today, I would argue we have 6 billion new neighbors. You see, to be a neighbor and to be a neighbor to someone in need, you have to first be aware of their needs. And until the advent of the mass media, television, radio, the internet, for the most part, we would not have been aware in the year 1900 or even 1950 perhaps. We might not even have been aware of the great needs of the poor of the world. We wouldn't have been aware of the malaria deaths and the famines that might be happening in Africa unless we happen to read something about them on page 10 of our newspaper. But today, we can't say awareness is the problem. The second thing you have to have for a neighbor is you have to have access to that neighbor in need. How would we have access in 1900 to someone living in Uganda or someone living in China or someone living 10,000 miles away? We would have had no access to those people. There was no international air travel. And it was not until the 1950s and 60s that international air travel made it possible for you or I to be anywhere in the world within 24 hours. I can be anywhere in the world in 24 hours, just flying on commercial airliners. So now we have awareness of the needs of our distant neighbors. We have access to our distant neighbors through international air travel. And then the third thing we need is the ability to do something about it. Again, 50 or 100 years ago, we didn't have the kind of medical breakthroughs that we have today. We didn't have the understanding of poverty that we have today. We didn't have the whole microfinance industry that helps us understand how to lift the poor out of poverty economically. We didn't have those tools that we have today, but today we have the ability to address all of the causes of poverty. So we have awareness, we have access, and we have the ability to help our neighbors in need all over the world. And we are really without excuse. So the answer to the question, who is my neighbor in the 21st century, is anyone in need around the world is my neighbor. And I'm commanded to love them as I would love my own children. But we don't act that way. We don't treat them like neighbors. Sometimes we're just not willing. We have the awareness, the access, and the ability, but we lack the will to make a difference.
The statistics are staggering. 1/4 of the world's population consumes 3/4 of the world's food. It means the middle half of the world has that last quarter. That leaves 1/4 of the world's population with nothing. Do you think that's what God has in mind? He wants us to share. We produce enough so that every person in the world can consume, I think it's 2,900 calories a day, but only 1/4 of us has all that food. God has given it to us to share with others, and shame on us if we are hoarding it for ourselves.
I sometimes imagine that I am stranded on a deserted island with 9 other people. There's just 10 of us. And that God gives me a huge basket of food and supplies and clean water. And then I ask, what would God expect of me if I was the only one of the 10 that got this goodie basket from God? Well, obviously, what would we tell our children? You have to share that with the other 9 people on the island. You have to share what God's given you. He's entrusted it to you, and you can help others with it. Well, isn't that the situation we find ourselves in America? God has given us a goodie basket full of amazing things for many of us. And He expects us to do the same thing we would want our children to do if they were on that deserted island with 9 other people, to share the wealth that God has given us and to share the blessings that He's bestowed upon us.